Odessa Calloway had escorted 11 brides safely to their new homes across the Utah and Nevada frontier, without once losing a single one between the railhead and the wedding. And she would say afterward, describing the morning that broke that streak, that the empty room at the Steele Ranch had felt wrong before she'd even fully processed why. The bed was made too carefully. That was the first thing she noticed. Tucked corners and smoothed blanket, arranged with a precision that no one climbing groggily out of bed at dawn would normally bother producing. The particular neatness of someone who had made it deliberately, after rising in the dark, rather than simply left it rumpled the way a person leaves a bed they intend to return to that same night. The second thing she noticed was the note, folded once and set square in the center of the washstand, weighted down with the small silver hairpin Prudence Cole had worn every day of the 4-day journey from the railhead at Ogden. Odessa read it standing exactly where she'd found it, her own pulse loud enough in her ears that she had to read the short message twice before its full meaning settled properly. "Miss Calloway," it read, "I am sorry to leave you with this to explain, and sorrier still that I could not tell you the truth before now. I am safe, and I intend to stay that way, and I ask only that you not look too hard for me, for both our sakes. Tell Mr. Steele I am grateful for his kindness, and ashamed of my own dishonesty toward a decent man who deserved better than what I gave him. Whatever comes of this morning, please believe that I chose it with clear eyes, not fear of him, and not regret at having come this far at all. P.C. I have carried a fair number of these stories to their proper ending by now, and I will say plainly that few mornings tested my own certainty the way that one tested Odessa's, standing in an empty room with a note that answered nothing while raising every question that actually mattered. The escort trade Odessa Calloway had built for herself across the previous 3 years had begun, as most practical necessities did, out of circumstances she had not particularly chosen. Her father, Marshal Wade Calloway, had spent 18 years keeping order across 3 Utah Territory counties before a fever took him quickly one bad winter, leaving Odessa, at 22, considerably more capable with a revolver and a tracking eye than most men twice her age, and considerably less prepared, financially, to simply wait around for a comfortable marriage to solve her situation. She had noticed, watching the marriage agencies in Salt Lake City conduct their business that first difficult spring after her father's death, that the women traveling west to meet husbands they'd only corresponded with on paper generally arrived at the railhead with no proper escort beyond whatever stage driver happened to be running the route that week, vulnerable to bandits, bad weather, and the particular loneliness of a long journey undertaken entirely among strangers. She had offered her services to the first agency willing to take a chance on a woman claiming she could manage the work as competently as any man, and had spent the 3 years since building a reputation careful enough that agencies now specifically requested her by name for their more nervous or more valuable clients. Prudence Cole had arrived at the Ogden railhead 11 days earlier with less luggage than most brides carried, and a watchfulness in her manner that Odessa, professionally attuned to reading passengers after 3 years of close travel with strangers, had noted immediately, without fully understanding its cause. Prudence startled easily at loud noises. She kept her sleeves buttoned tight at the wrist, even in the worst of the afternoon heat. She asked, more than once during their 4 days on the trail together, whether Odessa thought a woman could reasonably change her situation entirely and leave every part of her old life behind her without anyone from that old life ever managing to follow. Most anyone can start fresh out here, if they're determined enough about it, Odessa had told her, at the time reading the questions as ordinary nerves about frontier marriage rather than anything more specific. Distance and a new name solve a good many problems that felt unsolvable back east. That's most of why folks come out this way in the first place. Prudence had looked at her for a long moment after that answer, an expression Odessa would only properly understand once she'd read the note left behind on the washstand, and had simply nodded, filing the reassurance away for a use Odessa hadn't yet guessed at. What Wade Calloway taught Odessa's methodical search of Prudence's abandoned room drew on training she had absorbed so gradually across her childhood that she rarely stopped to consider its actual origin, watching her father work a dozen small mysteries across 18 years of keeping order in that territory, from missing livestock to considerably more serious matters he'd generally declined to discuss in detail at the supper table. Wade Calloway had never intended, by his own frequent admission, to raise a daughter who could read a room the way most lawmen read a wanted poster. But Odessa had trailed after him from an early age, curious, in a way her mother's gentler temperament had never quite discouraged, and he had found, somewhere along the way, that teaching her properly seemed considerably wiser than leaving her curiosity to develop haphazardly on its own. Most people lie badly with their words and worse with their belongings, he told her once, walking her through the aftermath of a minor burglary when she was perhaps 14, pointing out details she wouldn't have thought to notice on her own. A person tells you plenty just by what they packed in a hurry and what they left behind without seeming to care about it. The things they grab first are the things that actually matter to them. Everything else is just performance for whoever might be watching. She had not expected, building her escort trade 3 years after his death, to draw so directly on lessons he'd taught her as a girl, trailing him through crime scenes rather than as any formal preparation for chaperoning nervous brides across frontier distances. But the same careful attention to small, wrong details that had once helped her father solve a stolen horse case in an afternoon served her equally well, she discovered, in reading the particular quality of a bride's silence, or the specific way a young woman's hands trembled reaching for a teacup, long before whatever trouble she carried ever announced itself directly. "You've got good instincts," one of the Salt Lake City agency directors had told her, reviewing her first year of successful deliveries with evident satisfaction. "Considerably better than most of the men we've tried using for this work, if I'm honest about it." Odessa had accepted the compliment without correcting the assumption underneath it, that her competence was somehow unusual for a woman rather than simply the direct, traceable inheritance of a good lawman's patient teaching, understanding that some battles were worth fighting directly and others were better won quietly, one successfully delivered bride at a time, until the results spoke plainly enough on their own that nobody needed convincing further. Emory Steele's kindness. The evening before Prudence disappeared had, by every appearance, gone about as well as any first meeting between a mail-order bride and her intended could reasonably go. Emory Steele had met them at his gate outside Solace Springs, with a warmth that struck Odessa immediately as genuine rather than performed. A rancher in his early 30s, careful and unhurried in his manner, who had spent the whole evening meal asking Prudence considerate questions about her journey, rather than launching into the sort of eager, self-focused courtship talk Odessa had grown accustomed to enduring second-hand on other deliveries. "I don't expect you to feel settled here overnight," Emory had told Prudence, over supper, in a tone that carried no pressure behind it at all. "Take whatever time you need finding your feet. I corresponded with you these past 4 months, because your letters described someone thoughtful and capable, and I'd rather build something real slowly than rush toward a wedding neither of us feels certain about yet." Odessa had noted, watching Prudence's reaction to that particular kindness, something that looked almost like distress rather than relief crossing her face, before she'd managed to smooth it back into polite gratitude, a reaction Odessa filed away at the time as simple exhaustion from the road rather than anything more troubling, though she would return to that single unguarded expression a great many times over the following days, turning it over the way a person turns over a coin found unexpectedly heavy for its size. Prudence had retired early that first night, pleading fatigue, and Odessa, bunked in the small guest room adjoining hers per the arrangement's usual chaperone custom, had heard nothing through the thin wall to suggest anything beyond ordinary rest until she woke at dawn to an empty bed and a folded note. Odessa's search of the room, conducted with the same methodical care her father had once taught her to apply to any scene that didn't add up cleanly, turned up more than the note alone had revealed. Tucked into the lining of Prudence's traveling case, apparently overlooked in whatever hurried packing had preceded her departure, was a small, badly torn photograph, half a man's face visible on the remaining fragment, a jaw set hard, and eyes that carried, even in a faded tintype, an expression Odessa had learned across her father's years of law-keeping to recognize immediately for what it was. There was also, folded small at the bottom of the same case, a letter considerably older than any of the correspondence Prudence had exchanged with Emory Steele, written in a man's cramped, aggressive hand, demanding to know where she'd gone, and promising, in language Odessa read through once and then refused to reread, that she would regret leaving considerably more than she currently understood. She wasn't running from Emory Steele at all, Odessa said aloud, alone in the empty room, piecing the fuller shape of it together with the particular clarity that arrives once enough small, wrong details finally align into a single coherent picture. She was running from whoever tore this photograph, and she used this arrangement, used all of us, as the means of putting enough distance between herself and him that she could finally disappear for good. She found Emory in the ranch yard a short while later and watched his face move through disbelief, hurt, and finally, something closer to concern as she laid out what she'd found, carefully, without embellishment, understanding that whatever wounded pride he might reasonably feel at being left standing at his own wedding mattered considerably less, in that moment, than the plain fact that a frightened woman had trusted a stranger's escort service with a desperate, dangerous plan and needed, whatever came next, for that trust to be honored properly. She told me last night, before she went in, that she hoped I'd understand someday, Emory said slowly, turning his hat over in his hands. I thought she meant understand. If courtship took her longer than most, I didn't understand at all, clearly, not the actual shape of what she was carrying. He looked up at Odessa, with an expression that held considerably more resolve than self-pity. Whatever she needed from this arrangement, Miss Calloway, I'll not be the one who undoes it by chasing her down or making noise about a broken engagement. But if whoever wrote that letter comes looking for her here, I expect we're both going to need to decide, fairly quickly, what kind of men we intend to be about it. Why Emory wrote Emory Steele, had not written to the marriage agency out of loneliness exactly, or not only out of loneliness, and he explained the fuller truth of it to Odessa one evening during the anxious weeks of waiting, sitting on the porch steps with the particular openness of a man who had already shown her considerably more of himself than he'd originally planned to reveal to a hired chaperone. I was married before, briefly, back before I ever built this ranch up properly, he told her, turning his hat over slowly in his hands, the way she'd noticed he did when a subject required real effort to discuss. Her name was Clara. We were young, both of us, married barely 2 years, before a fever took her the same hard winter it took a good many people in this territory. I told myself for a long while afterward that I'd built this ranch as a kind of monument to what we'd planned together, and maybe that was even true for the first few years. What changed? Odessa asked, recognizing in his careful pacing a story that had clearly not been told often or easily. I got tired of living inside a monument, he said simply. 8 years is a long while to keep a place running well and come home every night to nobody but the work itself. I wrote to the agency because I wanted an actual life again, not because I'd forgotten Clara, or because any woman I married was meant to replace her, but because I finally understood that honoring what we'd had didn't require me to stay alone the whole rest of my days doing it. He glanced over at Odessa, something careful and searching in his expression. I told Prudence some of this, that first evening, which is likely part of why she looked so troubled hearing it. I expect being told a man wanted an honest, patient partnership rather than a performance felt like more pressure than comfort, given what she was actually carrying underneath her own silence. Odessa considered that account for a long moment before answering, understanding it as the missing piece that made sense of an evening she'd puzzled over since. She wasn't distressed by your kindness, Emory. She was grieving it, I think, knowing she couldn't actually accept what you were offering. Not honestly. Not while Harlan Cole was still out there believing he owned some claim on her. You gave her something real to walk away from, and I expect that hurt her considerably more than if you'd simply been the ordinary, indifferent stranger she was likely bracing herself to meet. He absorbed that reframing slowly, and something in his shoulders eased that she hadn't fully realized was tense until she watched it release. I hadn't thought of it that way, he admitted. It helps, actually, understanding it as grief rather than rejection. I've been turning that morning over more than I probably should, wondering what I did wrong. It's a considerable relief, hearing that the answer might simply be that I did something right, at the wrong possible moment for her to properly receive it. The man who came looking. He arrived 9 days later, a broad-shouldered man calling himself Harlan Cole and claiming Prudence as his lawfully wedded wife. Having tracked her, he explained with a calm that struck Odessa as considerably more unsettling than open anger would have been, through the marriage agency's Salt Lake City office and a paper trail of correspondence that eventually led him to the Steele Ranch outside Solace Springs. I understand a woman matching my wife's description passed through here recently, escorted by some manner of hired chaperone, Harlan said, standing in Emory's yard, with the particular false civility of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, dressed up as reasonableness. I'd be obliged if you'd tell me where she's gotten to. A husband has a right to know his own wife's whereabouts, whatever confusion she's caused in the meantime. Odessa had dealt, across her 3 years of escort work, with a fair number of difficult men, and she recognized in Harlan Cole's carefully modulated tone the particular danger of someone who had learned, over long practice, exactly how much menace he could dress, in reasonable language, before a stranger's suspicion caught up to him. I escort brides to their new homes, Mr. Cole, she said, matching his careful tone precisely. I don't keep track of where they go afterward, and I certainly wouldn't share that information with a stranger claiming a relationship I've got no way to verify. She's not your concern, Harlan said, the civility cracking just slightly at the edges now. Whatever story she's told you people, I'd remind you both that interfering in a lawful marriage is a serious matter, and I don't intend to leave this territory without finding my wife. Emory, standing beside Odessa with a stillness she recognized from their earlier conversation, spoke before she could answer further. You're welcome to search anywhere in this county the law permits you to search, Mr. Cole, same as any man, but you'll do it through proper channels, with a sheriff's involvement if it comes to that, and not by standing in my yard making threats, dressed up as reasonable requests. I've got no woman here, matching whatever description you're carrying, and I'll thank you to take your business elsewhere. Harlan Cole left the ranch that afternoon without the answer he'd come for, though Odessa understood, watching him ride off with a backward glance that carried considerably more calculation than defeat in it, that the matter was far from settled. She rode into Solace Springs that same evening and wired the county sheriff's office, along with a careful, factual account to the Salt Lake City marriage agency, describing exactly what she'd found in Prudence's abandoned traveling case, understanding that the torn photograph and the threatening letter constituted evidence considerably more useful in a courtroom than in a private argument on Emory Steele's porch. She thought often, across the anxious days that followed, while the sheriff's office quietly investigated Harlan Cole's actual marital status and the considerable list of complaints already filed against him in 2 other counties, of a line her father had kept clipped from an old abolitionist newspaper, tucked for years into the back of his own worn Bible, alongside a scattering of other sayings he'd apparently found worth preserving. "I feel safe in the midst of my enemies, for the truth is all-powerful and will prevail," Sojourner Truth had said, in a speech Odessa's father had heard secondhand from a fellow lawman who'd witnessed it decades earlier, and Odessa found herself returning to those words now, with a steadiness she hadn't expected to draw from a saying clipped so long before she'd ever needed it personally. Whatever else remained uncertain about Prudence Cole's situation, the truth of what Harlan Cole actually was, once properly documented and reported to people with the authority to act on it, carried a weight that his careful, threatening civility was never going to outlast for long. The sheriff's inquiry confirmed, within the week, that Harlan Cole was wanted on outstanding warrants in both Nevada and California for assault against 2 previous wives he had also, at various points, claimed were simply missing rather than fled, and he was arrested attempting to board an eastbound train at the Ogden Depot, still searching, by his own later admission to the arresting deputies, for a woman who had been considerably further away from his reach than he'd ever managed to discover. Sheriff Bridger's careful work, County Sheriff Tom Bridger, receiving Odessa's wire and the evidence she'd carefully preserved from Prudence's abandoned traveling case, moved with a deliberate thoroughness that Odessa found herself grateful for, even while the waiting stretched her patience thin across the following weeks. "I could ride out and arrest a man on a torn photograph and an old threatening letter, sure enough," Bridger told her, laying out his reasoning during her second visit to his Solace Springs office. "But a man like Harlan Cole, if he's the sort you're describing, has likely learned to talk his way clear of exactly that kind of thin case before, and I'd rather build something that holds properly than move fast and watch him walk free to keep hunting her regardless." He wired sheriff's offices in 3 neighboring territories, requesting any record of complaints matching Harlan Cole's description, and the responses that trickled back over the following 10 days painted a considerably more damning picture than even Odessa had anticipated. 2 previous wives, in 2 different states, both reported by neighbors and family as having simply vanished under circumstances local authorities had never adequately investigated at the time, and a pattern of violence documented, in one case, by a doctor's own written report of injuries too severe to explain away as an accident. "Men like this count on nobody ever comparing notes across county lines," Bridger said, reviewing the accumulated file with grim satisfaction. "Each individual sheriff sees 1 troubled marriage and 1 missing woman and figures it's a private, sorrowful matter rather than a pattern. It's only when someone patient enough bothers gathering the whole picture that the shape of it finally becomes impossible to explain away." Odessa found herself, watching the case build properly over those careful weeks, understanding something about her own father's old work that she'd absorbed as a child without ever fully articulating it in words, that the considerable patience required to build an honest case properly was itself a form of protection, slower than she might have liked in the moment but considerably more durable, in the end, than any single dramatic confrontation could have managed on its own. When Harlan Cole was finally arrested at the Ogden Depot, the warrant that took him into custody carried enough documented weight behind it that no clever talking was ever going to argue him free of it again. What grew in the waiting? The weeks between Harlan Cole's arrest and any word of Prudence's actual fate passed slowly for both Odessa and Emory, bound together by a shared secret, and a shared worry that neither had anticipated when a routine bride delivery had gone so thoroughly sideways. Odessa found reasons to extend her stay at the Steele Ranch beyond what her professional obligations strictly required, telling herself at first that she was simply waiting to see the matter properly resolved before returning to Salt Lake City, and admitting only gradually, across the particular unhurried rhythm of ranch mornings spent in Emory's company, that the reasons had grown considerably more personal than professional. "You didn't have to stay this long," Emory told her one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps, watching the last light fade over the ranch's western pasture. "The sheriff's got Cole in custody. The agency's been notified, and there's nothing left, strictly speaking, requiring your continued presence here." "I've never much cared for leaving a job unfinished," Odessa said, which was true enough as far as it went, though she suspected, hearing her own careful phrasing, that Emory understood the deeper truth beneath it as clearly as she did herself. "And I find I've grown considerably more curious about how a man handles disappointment with the sort of grace you've managed this month than my professional obligations strictly require me to be." He looked at her properly then, in the particular way she had noticed him looking more and more often across the previous weeks, a careful attention that had nothing to do with the bride he'd lost, and everything to do with the escort who'd stayed behind to see the whole difficult business through properly. "I was disappointed that first morning. I won't pretend otherwise," he admitted. "But I've found, watching you handle everything since, with more steadiness than I managed myself, that I'm considerably less troubled by how that morning ended than I probably ought to be, given what it apparently made room for instead." The letter arrived nearly 4 months later, postmarked from a town neither Odessa nor Emory recognized, addressed simply to the Steele Ranch outside Solace Springs. In handwriting Odessa recognized immediately, from the note left on the washstand that first difficult morning. "I hope this finds you both well, and I hope you'll forgive the delay in writing properly, given I needed to be certain enough time had passed that a letter couldn't be traced back to wherever I've actually settled," Prudence wrote. "I read, through channels I'd rather not describe, that Harlan was arrested, and that the truth of what he'd done to me, and to at least 2 other women, finally caught up with him properly. I am safe. I have found honest work and a small, quiet life, considerably further from that old danger than I ever managed on my own, before Miss Calloway's kindness and Mr. Steele's decency gave me the cover I needed to disappear for good. I am sorry, still, for the deception, though I find I am not sorry for the choice itself, having weighed the two against each other a great many times since. I hope whatever grew between you both in the aftermath of my leaving has grown into something worth the trouble I caused getting there." Odessa read the letter aloud to Emory twice, and found herself, by the second reading, considerably more moved than she'd expected by the particular grace of a woman who had survived real danger, finding the words to hope from a safe distance that her own difficult choice had left something good behind it, rather than only wreckage. "She's not wrong," Emory said quietly, once Odessa had folded the letter carefully away. "About what grew out of it. They married that spring at the small church in Solace Springs, a modest gathering that included, somewhat to Odessa's private amusement, 3 previous brides she had personally escorted to their own weddings across the territory over the preceding years. Women who had heard through careful frontier correspondence networks that the escort who'd once delivered them safely to new lives had finally found reason to stay in one place herself. One of them, a rancher's wife named Louisa, who Odessa had escorted nearly 2 years earlier to a homestead outside Provo, pulled her aside before the ceremony with a knowing, affectionate laugh. "I always wondered whether the woman handing every other bride her happiness ever intended to claim any for herself," Louisa said, adjusting the plain lace at Odessa's collar with the easy familiarity of an old friend, rather than a former client. I'm glad to see you finally took your own advice about starting fresh, somewhere new, even if this particular fresh start came considerably more roundabout than most. Sheriff Bridger attended as well, standing at the back of the small church with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had helped see a dangerous matter through to its proper legal conclusion. And he told Odessa afterward, shaking her hand at the small reception that followed, that her father would have been considerably proud watching her handle the whole difficult business, from the empty room at dawn through to the wedding day itself, with exactly the patient thoroughness he'd have expected from a daughter he'd trained so carefully. Odessa kept Prudence's 2 letters, the hurried note from the washstand and the longer one that arrived months later from somewhere safely west, folded together in the same drawer where she eventually kept her own wedding certificate. A reminder, she told the brides she continued escorting occasionally in the years that followed, that not every story that looked broken at first light was actually broken at all, and that sometimes the truest kindness a person could offer a frightened stranger was simply the patience to let her own account catch up properly with whatever had first looked, at dawn, like an ending rather than a beginning. She never did learn Prudence's exact whereabouts, and never once tried to find out, understanding plainly enough by then that some kindnesses were best measured by the questions a person chose not to ask. If this story kept you good company today, there's another one waiting just as true, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come, sit with us again soon, and bring whatever quiet worry you're carrying with you, because some mornings that look like endings are only ever beginnings, arriving considerably earlier than anyone expected them, and considerably better disguised.